Hello, microphone via the tube. Hello, and welcome back to another Plato reading. Last book, if I remember correctly, it was 4 days ago. They expanded on the idea of the sort of utopian city, the just city. They discussed the virtues of the city. It had what did they have? Had wisdom, courage, moderation, justice, and then they applied that city idea to the individual, where instead of it being the rulers, it is sort of the soul and its reason and its spirit and its body and all that sort of stuff, revealing that the whole city idea turned out to be a sort of metaphor for the internal state of one's soul and how it should be organized. They then went to talk about something else. They were just getting into something about the different types of governments, the different types of constitutions that you see in cities, and I assume they're then going to go and apply that to the individual. So let's get into that. All right. I'll read a little bit from the previous book because it sort of ends halfway through the sentence, and it wouldn't make sense to start straight at the start of book 5. So let's just sort of dive into it. Did I update my stream title? I did, yeah. Okay. Hopefully it'll be alright. The voice does feel a little weak today, but I haven't spoken in 4 days, so it should be fine. But we'll see how we go. It's a bit chilly today. It rained sometime earlier, so hopefully we're not too cold. How are we doing for frames? Doing alright for frames. Alright. So now it remains, it seems, to inquire whether it is more profitable to act justly, live in a fine way, and be just, whether one is known to be or not, or to act unjustly and be unjust, provided that one doesn't pay the penalty and become better as a result of punishment. But Socrates, this inquiry looks ridiculous to me, now that justice and injustice have been shown to be as we've described. Even if one has every kind of food and drink, lots of money, and every sort of power to rule, life is thought to not be worth living, when the body's nature is ruined. So even if someone can do whatever he wishes, except what will free him from vice and injustice, and make him acquire justice and virtue, how can it be worth living when his soul, the very thing by which he lives, is ruined and in turmoil? Yes, it is ridiculous. Nevertheless, now that we've come far enough to be able to see most clearly that this is so, we mustn't give up. That's absolutely right. We must... That's the last thing we must do. Then come here, so let's see how many forms of vice there are. Anyhow, that I consider worthy of examination. I'm following you. Just tell me. Well, from the vantage points we've reached in our argument, it seems to me that there is one form of virtue and an unlimited number of forms of vice, 4 of which are worth mentioning. How do you mean? It seems likely that there are as many types of soul as there are specific types of political constitutions. And how many is that? 5 forms of constitution, and 5 forms of souls. What are they? One is the constitution we've been describing, and it has 2 names. If one outstanding man emerges among the rulers, it is called a kingship. If more than one, it is called an aristocracy. That's true. Therefore, I say that this is one form of constitution, whether one man emerges or many. None of the significant laws of the city would be changed if they followed the upbringing and education we described. Probably not. There we go. That catches us up to where Book 5 starts. Book 5. This is the kind of city and constitution, then, that I call good and correct, and so too is this kind of man. And indeed, if this is the correct kind, all the others, whether as city governments or as organizations of the individual soul, are bad and mistaken. Their badness is of 4 kinds. What are they? I was going to enumerate them and explain how I thought they developed out of one another. This will happen later. But Polemarchus, who was sitting a little further away than Adamantus, extended his hand and took hold of the latter's cloak by the shoulder from above. He drew Adamantus towards him, while he himself leaned forward and said something to him. We overheard nothing what he said, except the words, "Shall we let it go, or what?" "We certainly won't let it go," Adamantus said, now speaking aloud. And I asked, "What is it that you won't let go?" "You," he said. "For what particular reason?" "We think you're slacking off, and that you cheated us out of a whole important section of the discussion in order to avoid having to deal with it. You thought we wouldn't notice when you said, as though it were something trivial, that as regards to wives and children, anyone could see that the possessions of friends should be held in common." "But isn't that right, Adamantus?" "Yes, it is, but this right, like the other things we've discussed, requires an explanation. In this case, an explanation of the manner in which they are to be held in common. For there may be many ways of doing this, so don't omit telling us about the particular one you mean. We've been waiting for some time indeed for you to tell us about the production of children, how they'll be produced, and once born, how they'll be brought up, and about the whole subject of having wives and children in common. We think this makes a considerable difference. Indeed, all the difference to whether a constitution is correct or not. So now, since you're beginning to describe another constitution before having adequately described these things, we are resolved, as you overheard, not to let you off until you explain this as fully as the rest." "Include me," Glaucon said, "as a partner in this resolution." "In fact, Socrates," Thrasymachus added, "you can take this as a resolution of all of us." What a thing you've done," I said, "in stopping me. What an argument you've started up again from the very beginning, as it were, about the Constitution. I was delighted to think that it had already been described, and was content to leave these things accepted, as they were stated before. You don't realise what a swarm of arguments you've stirred up by calling me to account now. I saw the swarm and passed the topic by in order to save us a lot of trouble." "Well," said Thrasymachus, "are we here to search for gold, or listen to an argument?" "The latter," I said, "but within reason." "It's within reason, Socrates," Glaucon said, "for people with any understanding to listen to an argument of this kind their whole life long. So don't mind about us, and don't get tired yourself. Rather, tell us at length what your thoughts are on the topic we inquired about, namely what the common possession of wives and children will amount to for the guardians, and how the children will be brought up while they're still small. For the time between birth and the beginning of education seems to be the most difficult period of all. So tell us what the manner of this upbringing must be." "It isn't an easy subject to explain, for it raises even more incredulity than the topics we've discussed so far. People may not believe that what we say is possible, or that, even if it could be brought about, it would be for the best. It's for this reason that I hesitated to bring it up, namely that our argument might seem to be no more than wishful thinking." "Then don't hesitate, for your audience isn't inconsiderate, incredulous, or hostile." Are you trying to encourage me by saying that? I am. Well, you're doing the opposite. Your encouragement would be fine, if I could be sure I was speaking with knowledge. For one can feel both secure and confident when one knows the truth about the dearest and most important things, and speaks about them among those who are themselves wise and dear friends. But to speak as I'm doing, at a time when one is unsure of oneself and searching for the truth, is a frightening and insecure thing to do. I'm afraid of being laughed at. That would be childish indeed. But I am afraid if I slip from the truth, just where it's most important not to, I'll not only fool myself, but drag my friends down as well. So I bow to Adrastea for what I'm going to say. For I suspect that it's a lesser crime to kill someone involuntarily than to mislead people about fine and good and just institutions. Since it's better to run this risk among enemies than among friends, you've well and truly encouraged me. Hello, Rododon something anomaly. Forgive me. Glaucon laughed and said, "Well, Socrates, if we suffer from any false notes you strike in the argument, we'll release you and absolve you of any guilt, as in a homicide case. Your hands are clean, and you have not deceived us. So take courage and speak." "I will. For the law says that someone who kills involuntarily is free of guilt when he's absolved by the injured party. So it's surely reasonable to think the same is true in my case as well. With that as your defence, do speak." Then I'll have to go back to what should perhaps have been said in sequence. Although it may be that this way of doing things is in fact right, and that after the completion of the male drama, so to speak, we should then go through the female one, especially as you insist on it so urgently. For men born and educated, as we've described, there is, in my opinion, no right way to acquire and use women and children other than by following the road which we started them. We attempted, in the argument, to set up the men as guardians of the herd. Yes. Then let's give them a birth and rearing consistent with that, and see whether it suits us or not. And how should we do that? As follows. Do we think that the wives of our guardian watchdogs should guard what the males guard, hunt with them, and do everything else in common with them? Or should we keep the women at home, as incapable of doing this, since they must bear and rear the puppies, while the males work, and have the entire care of the flock? Everything should be in common, except that the females are weaker and the males are stronger. And is it possible to use any animals for the same things, if you don't give them the same upbringing and education? No, it isn't. Therefore, if we use the women for the same thing as the men, they must also be taught the same thing. Yes. Now, we gave the men music and poetry and physical training. Yes. Then we must give these two crafts as well to those having to do with warfare, to the women able to use in the same way as the men use them. That seems to follow from what you say. But perhaps... Hang on, did I skip a page? Did I? No, I didn't. But perhaps much of what we are saying, since it is contrary to custom, would incite ridicule if it were carried out in practice as we've described. It certainly would. What is the most ridiculous thing you see in it? Isn't it obviously that women exercising naked in the palestras with the men are not just the young women, but the older ones too, like old men in gymnasium who, even though their bodies are wrinkled and not pleasant to look at, still love to do physical training? Yes, that really would be ridiculous, as things stand as present. But surely now we've started to speak about this, we mustn't fear the various jokes that wits will make about this kind of change in music and poetry, physical training, and, last but not least, in bearing arms and riding horses. You're right. And now that we've begun to speak about this, we must move on to the tougher part of the law, begging these people not to be silly, though that is their own work, but to take the matter seriously. They should remember that it wasn't very long ago that the Greeks themselves thought it shameful and ridiculous, as the majority of barbarians still do, for even men to be seen naked, and that when the Cretans and the Lacedaemonians began the gymnasiums, the wits of those times could also have ridiculed it all. Oh, don't you think so? I certainly do. But I think that after it was found in practice to be better to strip than to cover up all those parts, then what was ridiculous to the eyes faded away, in face of what argument showed to be the best. This makes it clear that it's foolish to think that anything besides the bad is ridiculous, or to try to raise a laugh at the sight of anything besides what's stupid or bad, or, putting it the other way around, it's foolish to take seriously any standard of what is fine and beautiful other than the good. That's absolutely true. However, mustn't we first agree about whether our proposals are possible or not? And mustn't we give to anyone who wishes the opportunity to question us, whether in jest or in earnest, about whether female human nature can share all the tasks as that of the male, or none of them, or some but not others, and to ask in what class the waging of war belongs? Wouldn't this, as the best beginning, also be likely to result in the best conclusion? Of course. Shall we give the argument against ourselves, then, on behalf of those who share those reservations, so that their side of the question doesn't fall by default? There's no reason not to. Then let's say this on their behalf. Socrates and Glaucon, there's no need for others to argue with you, for you yourselves, when you began to found your city, agreed that each must do his own work, in accordance with his nature. And I think we certainly did agree with that. Can you deny that a woman is, by nature, very different from a man? Oh, of course not. And isn't it appropriate to assign different work to each in accordance with its nature? Certainly. How is it, then, that you aren't mistaken and contradicting yourselves when you say that men and women must do the same things, when the natures are so completely separate and distinct? Do you have any defense against that attack? It isn't easy to think of one on the spur of the moment, so I'll ask you to explain the argument on our side as well, whatever that may be. This and many other such things, Glaucon, which I foresaw earlier, were what I was afraid of, so that I hesitated to tackle the law concerning the possession and upbringing of women and children. Oh, my God, it doesn't seem to be an easy topic. It isn't. But the fact is that whether someone falls into a small diving pool or in the middle of the biggest ocean, he must swim all the same. He certainly must. Then we must swim too, and try to save ourselves from the sea of argument, hoping that a dolphin will pick us up, or that we'll be rescued by some other desperate means. They're alluding to the story of Arion, there, man who was thrown overboard but was rescued by dolphins. It seems so. Come then, let's see if we can find a way out. We agreed that different natures must follow different ways of life, and that the natures of men and women are different. But now we say that these different natures must follow the same way of life. Isn't the accusation brought against us? That's it exactly. Ah, Glaucon, great is the power of the craft of disputation. Why is that? Because many fall into it against their wills. They think they are having not a quarrel, but a conversation, because they are unable to examine what has been said by dividing it up according to forms. Hence, they pursue mere verbal contradictions of what has been said and have a quarrel rather than a conversation. That does happen to lots of people, but it hasn't happened to us at the moment, is it? It most certainly is happening to us, for it looks to me, at any rate, as though we are falling into disputation against our will. How? We're bravely, but in a quarrelsome and merely verbal fashion, pursuing the principle that natures aren't the same must follow different ways of life. But when we assigned different ways of life to different natures, and the same ones to the same, we didn't at all examine the form of natural difference and sameness we had in mind, or in what regard we were distinguishing them. No, we didn't look at that at all. Therefore, we might just as well, it seems, ask ourselves whether the natures of the bald and the long-haired men are the same or opposite. And when we agree that they are the opposite, then, if the bald ones are cobblers, we ought to forbid the long-haired ones to be cobblers. Or if the long-haired ones are cobblers, we ought to forbid the bald ones. Oh, that would be ridiculous. And aren't we ridiculous by being in this position? But because at the same time, we did not introduce every form of difference and sameness in nature, but focused only on one form of sameness and difference that was relevant to the particular ways of life. We meant, for example, that a male and female doctor have souls of the same nature, or don't you think so? I do. But a doctor and a carpenter have different natures. Completely different, surely. Therefore, if the male sex is seen to be different than the female with regard to a particular craft or way of life, we'll say that the relevant one must be assigned to it. But if it's apparent that they differ only in this respect, that the females bear children while the males beget them, we'll say that there's been no kind of proof that women are different from men with respect to what we're talking about, and we'll continue to believe that our guardians and their wives must have the same way of life. And rightly so. One moment, I forgot to check how many pages this chapter is, so I know how to pace myself. Let's see, we're on book 5. How long does it go on for? It goes to 1107, so we are on 83 now. Alright. Where was I now? And rightly so. Next, we'll tell anyone who holds the opposite view to instruct us in this, with regard to what craft or way of life involved in the constitution of the city are the natures of men and women, not the same, but different. That's a fair question, at any rate. And perhaps he'd say, just as you did a moment ago, that it isn't easy to give an immediate answer, but with enough consideration, it should not be difficult. Yes, he might say that. Shall we ask the one who raises the objection to follow us, and see whether we can show him that no way of life concerned with the management of the city is peculiar to women? Of course. Come then, we'll say to him. Give us an answer. Is this what you meant by one person being naturally well suited for something, and another being naturally unsuited? That the one learned it easily, the other with difficulty? That the one, after only a brief period of instruction, was able to find out things for himself, while the other, after much instruction, couldn't even remember what he had learned? That the body of the one adequately served his thoughts, while the body of the other opposed his? Are there any other things beside these by which you distinguish those who are naturally well suited for anything from those who are not? No one will claim that there are any others. Do you know of anything practiced by human beings in which the male sex isn't superior to the female in all these ways? Or must we make a long story of it by mentioning weaving, baking cakes, and cooking vegetables, in which the female sex is believed to excel, and in which it is most ridiculous of all for it to be inferior? It's certainly true that one sex is much superior to the other in pretty well everything, although many women are better than many men in many things. But on the whole, it is as you say. Then there is no way of life concerned with the management of the city that belongs to a woman, because she's a woman, or to a man because he's a man, but because of the various natures that are distributed in the same way in both creatures. Women share by nature in every way of life, just as men do, but in all of them, women are weaker than men. Certainly. Then shall we assign all of them to men and none to women? How can we? We'll say, I suppose, that one woman is a doctor and another not, and that one is musical by nature, and another not, of course. And therefore, won't one be athletic or warlike, while another is unwarlike, and no lover of physical training? I suppose so. Further, isn't one woman philosophical, or a lover of wisdom, while another hates wisdom? And isn't one spirited and another spiritless? That too. So, one woman may have a guardian nature, and another not. For wasn't it the qualities of this sort that we looked for in the nature of men we selected as guardians? Certainly. Therefore, men and women are by nature the same, with respect to guarding the city, except to the extent that one is weaker and the other is stronger. Apparently. Then, women of this sort must be chosen along with men of the same sort, to live with them and share their guardianship, seeing that they are adequate for the task, and akin to men in nature. Certainly. And mustn't we assign the same way of life to the same natures? We must. We've come round, then, to what we said before, and have agreed that it isn't against nature to assign an education in music, poetry, and physical training to the wives of the guardians. Absolutely. Then, we're not legislating impossibilities, or indulging in mere wishful thinking, since the law we've established is in accord with nature. It's rather the way things are at present that seems to be against nature. So it seems. Now, weren't we trying to determine whether our proposals were both possible and optimal? Yes, we were. And haven't we now agreed that they are possible? Yes. Mustn't we next reach agreement about whether or not they're optimal? Clearly. Should we have one kind of education to produce women guardians, then and another to produce men, especially as they have the same natures to begin with? No. Then, what do you think about this? About what? About one man being better and another worse? Or do you think they're all alike? Oh, certainly not. In the city we're establishing, who do you think will prove to be better men? The guardians, who receive the education we've described, or the cobblers, who are educated in cobblery? Your question is ridiculous. I understand. Indeed, aren't the guardians the best of the citizens? By far. And what about the female guardians? Aren't they the best of women? They are by far the best. Is there anything better for a city than having the best possible men and women as its citizens? There isn't. And isn't music and poetry and physical training lending their support in the way we've described that brings this about? Of course. Then the law we've established isn't only possible, it is also optimal for a city. It seems so. Then the guardian women must strip for physical training, since they'll wear virtue or excellence instead of clothes. They must share in war and the other guardians' duties in the cities, and do nothing else. But the lighter parts must be assigned to them because of the weakness of their sex, and the man who laughs at naked women doing physical training for the sake of what is best is plucking the unripe fruit. Or of laughter, and doesn't know, it seems, what he's laughing at, or what he's doing, for it is, and always will be, the finest saying that the beneficial is beautiful, while the harmful is ugly. Absolutely. Can we say, then, that we've escaped one wave of criticism in our discussion about the law about women, and that we haven't altogether swept away by laying down that male and female guardians must share their entire way of life, and that our argument is consistent when it states that this is both possible and beneficial? And it's certainly no small wave that you have escaped. You won't think that it's so big when you look at the next one. Tell me about it, and I'll decide. I suppose that the following law goes along with the last one, and the others that preceded it. Which one? Let me drink some water here. Which one? Of speaking of laws, that all these women are to belong in common to all the men, that none are to live privately with any man, and that the children, too, are to be possessed in common, so that no parent will know his own offspring, or any child his parents. Oh, this wave is far bigger than the other, for there's doubts both about its possibility, about whether or not it's beneficial. I don't think that its being beneficial would be disputed, or that it would be denied that the common possession of women and children would be the greatest good, if indeed it is possible. But I think that there would be a lot of disagreement about whether or not it is possible. There could very well be dispute about that. You mean that I'll have to face a coalition of arguments? I thought I'd escape one of them. If you believed that the proposal was beneficial, and that I'd have only about and I'd have only the one about whether or not it's possible left to deal with. But you didn't escape unobserved, so you'll have to give an argument for both. Well then, I'll have to accept my punishment. But do me this favour. Let me, as if on a holiday, do what lazy people do, who feast on their own thoughts when out for a solitary walk. Instead of finding out how something they desire might actually come about, these people pass that over, so as to avoid tiring deliberations about what's possible and what isn't. They assume that what they desire is available, and proceed to arrange the rest, taking pleasure in thinking through everything they do, even when they have what they want, thereby making their lazy souls even lazier. I'm getting soft myself at the moment, so I want to delay consideration. Consideration of the feasibility of our proposal until later. With your permission, I'll assume that it's feasible, and examine how the rulers will arrange these matters when they come to pass. And I'll try to show that nothing could be more beneficial to the city and its guardians than those arrangements. These are the things I'll examine with you first, and I'll deal with the other questions later, but only if you'll permit me to do it this way. You have my permission, so carry on with your examination. I suppose that our rulers and auxiliaries, if indeed they're worthy of the names, will be willing to command and to obey respectfully. In some cases, the rulers will themselves be obeying our laws, and in others, namely the ones we leave to their discretion, they'll give directions that are in the spirit of our laws. Probably so. Then you, as their lawgiver, will select women just as you did with men, with nature as similar to theirs as possible, and hand them over to the men. And since they have the common dwellings and meals, rather than private ones, and live together and mix together, both in physical training and in respect to their upbringing, they will, I suppose, be driven by innate necessity to have sex with one another. Or don't you think we're talking about necessities here? The necessities aren't geometrical, but erotic, and they're probably better than the others at persuading and compelling the majority of people. That's right. But the next point, Glaucon, is that promiscuity is impious in a city of happy people, and the rulers won't allow it. No, for it isn't right. Then it's clear that our next task will be to make marriage as sacred as possible, and that sacred marriages will be those that are most beneficial. Absolutely. How, then, will they be most beneficial? Tell me this, Glaucon. I see that you have hunting dogs, and quite a flock of noble fighting birds, at the home. Have you noticed anything about their mating and breeding? Like what? In the first place, although they're all noble, aren't there some that are the best, and prove themselves to be? There are. Do you breed them all alike, or do you try to breed from the best as much as possible? I try to breed from the best. And do you breed from the youngest, or from the oldest, or from those in their prime? From those in their prime. And do you think that, if they weren't bred in this way, your stock of birds and dogs would get worse. I do. What about horses and other animals? Are things any different with them? It would certainly be strange. It would be strange if they were. Dear me. If this also holds true of human beings, our need for excellent rulers is indeed extreme. It does hold of them, but what of it? Because our rulers then will have to use a lot of drugs. And while an inferior doctor is adequate for people who are willing to follow a regimen and don't need drugs, when drugs are needed, we know that a bolder doctor is required. That's true, but what exactly do you have in mind? I mean that it looks as though our rulers will have to make considerable use of falsehood and deception for the benefit of those they rule. And we said that all such falsehoods are useful like a form of a drug. And we were right. Well, it seems that we were right, especially where marriages and the production of children is concerned. How so? It follows from our previous argument, first, that the best men must have sex with the best women as frequently as possible, while the opposite is true of the most inferior men and women. And second, that if our herd is to be of the highest possible quality, the former's offspring must be reared, but not the latter's. And this must all be brought about without being noticed by anyone except the rulers, so that our herd of guardians remains as free from dissension as possible. That's absolutely right. Therefore, certain festivals and sacrifices will be established by Lord which will bring the brides and grooms together, and will direct our poets to compose appropriate hymns for the marriages that'll take place. We'll leave the number of marriages for the rulers to decide, but their aim will be to keep the number of males as stable as they can, taking into account war, disease, and similar factors, so that the city will, as far as possible, become neither too big nor too small. That's right. Then, there'll have to be some sort of sophisticated lotteries involved, so that at each marriage, the inferior people we mentioned will blame luck, rather than the rulers when they aren't chosen. There will. And among other prizes and rewards, the young men who are good in war and other things must be given permission to have sex with the women more often, since this will also be a good pretext for having them father as many children as possible. That's right. And then, as the children are born, they'll be taken over by the officials and appointed for the purpose, who have been appointed for the purpose, who may be either men or women or both, since our offices are open to both sexes. Yes. I think they'll take the children of good parents to the nurses in charge of the rearing pen, situated in a separate part of the city. But the children of inferior parents, or any child of the others that is born defective, they'll hide in a secret and unknown place, as is appropriate. It is, if indeed the guardian breed is to remain pure. And won't the nurses also see to it that the mothers are brought to the rearing pen when their breasts have milk, taking every precaution to ensure that no mother knows her own child, and providing wet nurses if the mother's milk is insufficient? And won't they take care that the mothers suckle the children for only a reasonable amount of time, and that the care of sleepless children and other such troublesome duties are taken over by the wet nurses and other attendants? You're making it very easy for the wives of the guardians to have children. And that's only proper. So, let's take up the next thing we proposed. We said that the children's parents should be in their prime. True. Do you share that the view of a woman's prime lasts about 20 years, and a man about 30? Which years are those? A woman is to bear children for the city from the age of 20 to the age of 40, a man from the time he passes his peak as a runner until he reaches around 55. At any rate, that's the physical and mental prime for both. Then, if a man who is younger or older than that engages in reproduction for the community, we'll say that his offence is neither pious nor just, for the child he begets for the city if it remains hidden, will be born in darkness, for a dangerous weakness of will, and without the benefit of sacrifices and prayers offered at every marriage festival, in which the priests and priestesses, together with the entire city, ask the children of good and beneficial parents, may always prove themselves still better and more beneficial. That's right. The same law will apply if a man still of begetting years has a child with a woman of childbearing age without the sanction of the rulers. We'll say that he brings the city an illegitimate, unauthorized, and unallowed child. That's absolutely right. However, I think that when women and men pass the age of having children, we'll leave them free to have sex with whoever they wish, with these exceptions. For a man, his daughter, his mother, his daughter's children, and his mother's ancestors. For a woman, her son and his descendants, her father and his ancestors. Having received these instructions, they should be very careful not to let a single fetus see the light of day. But if one is conceived and forces its way to the light, they must deal with it in the knowledge that no nurture is available to it. That's certainly sensible. But how would they recognize their fathers and daughters and the others you mentioned? They have no way of knowing, but a man will call all the children born in the 10th or 7th month after he became a bridegroom his sons. If they're male, and his daughters. If they're female, and they'll call him father. He'll call their children his grandchildren, and they'll call the group to which he belongs grandfathers and grandmothers. And those who were born at the same time as their mothers and fathers were having children, they'll call their brothers and sisters. Thus, as we're saying, the relevant groups will avoid sexual relations with one another, but the law will allow brothers and sisters to have sex with one another, if the lottery works out that way, and the Pythia approves. The Pythia is the priestess of Apollo. That's absolutely right. This, then, Glaucon, is how the guardians of your city have their wives and children in common. We must now confirm this arrangement and see whether it is both consistent with the rest of the Constitution and by far the best. Or how else are we to proceed? In just that way. Then, isn't the first step towards agreement to ask ourselves what we say is the greatest good in designing the city, the good at which the legislator aims in making the laws, and what is the greatest evil? And in the next step, to examine whether the system we've just described fits into the tracks of the good, and not into those of the bad. Absolutely. Is there any greater evil we can mention for a city than that which tears it apart and makes it many instead of one? Or any greater good than that which binds it together and makes it one? There certainly isn't. And when, as far as possible, all the citizens rejoice and are pained by the same successes and failures, doesn't this sharing of pleasures and pains bind the city together? It most certainly does. But when some suffer greatly, while others rejoice greatly, at the same things happening to the city and its people, or doesn't this privatization of pleasures and pains dissolve the city? Of course. And isn't that what happens whenever such words as mine and not mine aren't used in unison, and similarly with someone else's? Precisely. Hello, Merly. It is indeed rather late. Sleep schedule is it's gone. I woke up a few hours ago. This is how it goes. Then, is the best governed city the one in which most people say mine and not mine about the same things in the same way? It is indeed. What about the city that is most like a single person? For example, one of us hurts his finger, the entire organism that binds body and soul together into a single system, under the ruling part within it, is aware of this, and the whole part feels the pain together with the part that suffers. That's why we say that a man who has pain in his finger. And the same can be said about any parts of a man, with regard either to the pain it suffers or to the pleasure it experiences when it finds relief. Certainly, And as for your question, the city with the best government is most like a person. Then, whenever anything good or bad happens to a single one of its citizens, such a city, above all others, will say that the affected part is its own, and will share in the pleasure or pain as a whole. If it has good laws, that must be so. It's time now to return to our own city, to look there for the features we've agreed on, and to determine whether it or some other city possesses them to the greatest degree. I wonder what Plato's political system would look like today. Well, from what we've read, I think the book 1984 would describe it pretty well. Actually, no, it'd be even worse than that. They were just now talking about all sorts of strange mating rituals involving incest and stuff. Very, very bizarre. But I think it's all a metaphor, so. It's time now we return to our own city, to look there for the features we've agreed on, and to determine whether it, or some other city, possesses them to the greatest degree. Then that's what we must do. What about these other cities? Aren't there rulers and people in them, as well as in ours? Yeah, I think it genuinely isn't a metaphor though. Like, at least I hope so. There are. Besides fellow citizens, what do people call the rulers in these other cities? Well, in many places they call them despots, but in democracies they are called rulers. What about the people in our cities? Besides fellow citizens, what do they call their rulers? Well, they call them guardians, preservers, auxiliaries. And what do they in turn call the people? Providers of upkeep and wages. What do the rulers call the people in other cities? Slaves. What do the rulers call each other? Co-rulers. And as? Co-guardians. Can you tell me whether a ruler in those other cities could address some of his co-rulers as his kinsmen, and others as outsiders? Yes, many could. And doesn't he consider his kinsman to be his own? And doesn't he address him as such, while he considers the outsider not to be his own? He does. What about the guardians? Could any of them consider a co-guardian as an outsider, or address him as such? Well, there's no way he could, for when he meets any one of them, he'll hold that he's meeting with a brother or sister, a father or mother or son or daughter, or some ancestor or descendants of theirs. You put that very well. But tell me this. Will your laws require them simply to use these kinship names, or also to do all the things that go along with the names? Must they show to their fathers the respect, solicitude, and obedience we show to our parents by law? Won't they fare worse at the hands of gods and humans? As people whose actions are neither pious nor just if they do otherwise? Will these be the oracular sayings they hear from all the citizens from their childhood on? Or will they hear something else about their fathers, or the ones they're told about their fathers, and their other relatives? Well, the former. It would be absurd if they only mouthed kinship names without doing the things that go along with them. Therefore, in our city more than any other, they'll speak in unison the words we've mentioned a moment ago. When any one of them is doing well or badly, they'll say that mine is doing well or that mine is doing badly. That's absolutely true. Now, didn't we say that having expressed this conviction, didn't we say that the having and expressing of this conviction is closely followed by the having of pleasures and pains in common? Yes, we did say that. Then won't our citizens, more than any others, have the same thing in common? The one they call mine, and having that in common, won't they, more than any others, have common pleasures and pains? Of course. And in addition to the other institutions, the cause of this having of wives and children in commons by the guardians. That, more than anything else, is the cause. But we've agreed that the having of pains and pleasures is common is the greatest good for a city, and we've characterized a well-governed city in terms of the body's relation to pain or pleasure in any one of its parts. And we were right to agree. It's only dawning on me now how that's true, Socrates. It's still there. It's still there. It's still there. There's no reason for there to be another person. In fact, there was which one was it? I forget what the name. It might have been the Gorgias or something. Where about halfway through the dialogue, the person Socrates is speaking to gets so sick and tired of listening to Socrates that he leaves. He walks out of the argument and tells Socrates to argue with himself. And Socrates does exactly that. He just starts arguing with himself, and he gives his reply. He says, and don't we think this, Socrates? Yes, I think so. And he's talking to himself. It was hilarious. Absolute madman. Something about pains and pleasures in common being the greatest good for a city. And we characterized a well-governed city in terms of the body's reaction to pain and pleasure in any one of its parts. And we were right to agree. Then the cause of the greatest good for our city has been shown to be the having of wives and children in common with the auxiliaries. It has. And of course, this is consistent with what we've said before. For we said somewhere that if they're going to be guardians, they mustn't have private houses, property, or possessions, but must receive their upkeep from the other citizens as a wage for their guardianship and enjoy it in common. That's true. I mean, I get that Socrates, the supposed person, didn't write at all and only talked, so Plato's just writing what he thinks Socrates would have done. Casual schizophrenia versus complete schizophrenia. Indeed, I will say that it is a good... No, wait. How would I describe it? I think Plato's intention by having this Socrates character in all his works, and never himself, I think the intention is that he wants to hide himself. He doesn't want people to see Plato. He wants them to see Socrates, someone who's not himself, in a similar sort of way how when you watch a play, you don't see the actor, you see the character. I think that's the intention. It has an immersive effect. He's hiding himself. You see, many philosophical textbooks will be just that. There'll be a textbook. You're reading the words, you're reading their opinions, and it feels very, very literal. But when you read a story like this, where it's almost made to be like a fiction, you're immersed in a story, it has a different effect. It has a different effect, and it's very underrated. Okay, something about keeping the wives in common with the guardians. Then isn't it true, just as I claimed, that what we are saying now, taken together with what we said before, makes even better guardians out of them, and prevents them from tearing the city apart by not calling the same thing mine? If different people apply the term to different things, one would drag into his own house whatever he could separate from others, and another would drag different things into a different house, to a different wife and children, and this would make for private pleasures and pains at private things. But our people, on the other hand, will think of the same things as their own, and aim at the same goal, and, as far as possible, feel pleasure and pain in unison. Precisely. And what about lawsuits and mutual accusations? Won't they pretty well disappear from among them, because they'll have everything in common except for their own bodies? Hence they'll be spared all the dissension that arises between people because of the possession of money, children, and families, that necessarily could be spared it. Nor could any, they'll necessarily be spared it. Nor could any lawsuits for insult or injury justly occur among them, for we'll declare that it's a fine and just thing for people to defend themselves against others of the same age, since this will compel them to stay in good physical shape. That's right. I can see that. The earliest philosophers were very honest about this whole thing, probably because there wasn't much money in it. Yet, maybe the parts that revolved more around maths. Hmm. I'm not sure what you mean, Merle. Hmm. Something. There wasn't much money. There is another interesting thing about old philosophy. For a long time in the beginning, it was very deliberately done through poetry to obfuscate it even further. They would they would write their philosophy in ways that are hard to understand. I think it serves purposes where it in a sense poetry ages better than prose, where you communicate sort of the essence of something rather than using any literal words. And also by making it harder to understand, it means you have to struggle to understand it, so that the only people who do understand it are the people who want to understand it. A bit of a manipulative effect there. What I mean is, the sophists clearly sold a service. It was a dishonest form of philosophy, but Socrates and Plato didn't really do it for the money. Maybe if you ended up being the tutor to a future conqueror, you'd be well off. But philosophy by itself probably didn't pay. Indeed, it's sort of people in these books. Socrates is very often criticised for wasting his time sitting in corners arguing with people over trivial nonsense. There's a I forget I think it might have been Euclid or something. There was a sort of mathematician, but essentially a philosopher, who was doing lectures, and someone in the crowd called out and asked him. They said, "What can I gain from this?" And so he turns to one of his servants and he says to the servant, he says, "Give this man some money. He wants to gain something from philosophy," which is rather funny. I'm gonna take a break to catch my breath here. We're about halfway through, so these Plato dialogues are quite tough on the voice. I suspect it would have been a quite a trivial amount of money, be a bronze coin or something you could buy a loaf of bread with. Like an oboe, I think they had was their common coin. There was one I forget the name, began with a C, I think. There's one philosopher who was quite wealthy, but he was very bizarre in his wealth. He would bury his wealth all around the town in conspicuous locations, so that wherever he is, he could always access his money. And every now and then, people would they'd be digging a hole and they'd find some coins, and people would say, "No, no, leave those there. They belong to that guy. He's put his coins there." It's a way to beat the banking system. Well, I'm not sure it's a very effective system. I imagine he lost quite a lot of money. All right, where were we? Stuff about if everyone treats everyone the same. We got ancient Greek communism. They were just speaking about lawsuits. I'll probably go to bed for now. I got something important to do tomorrow. You take care. You take care, Marley. This law is also correct for another reason. If a spirited person vents his anger in this way, it will be less likely to lead him into a more serious disputes. Certainly. But an older person will be authorized to rule and punish all the younger ones. Clearly. And surely it's obvious that a younger person won't strike or do any sort of violence to an older one, or fail to show him respect in other ways, unless the rulers command it. For if there are two guardians sufficient to prevent him from doing such things, shame and fear, shame will prevent him from laying a hand on his parents, and so will the fear that the others would come to the aid of the victim, some as his sons, and some as his brothers, and some as his fathers. That's the effect they'll have. Then in all cases, won't the laws induce men to live at peace with one another? Very much so. And if there's no discord among the Guardians, then there's no danger that the rest of the city will break out into civil war, either with them or among themselves. Certainly not. I. One moment. One moment, I'll be right back. Alright, I'm back. Hopefully no more distractions. Whatever. Where was I? Lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah. Hold on. Distractions. Bah. Alright. Alright. Unfortunate. But let's go back a few lines. Hopefully we can regain our train of thought. And what about lawsuits and mutual accusations? Won't they pretty well disappear from among them? Because they have everything in common except their own bodies. Hence they'll be spared all the dissension that arises between people of the possession of money and children and families. Necessarily, they'll be spared it. Nor could any lawsuits for injury or insult justly occur among them, for Will declared that it's a fine and just thing for people to defend themselves against other people of the same age, since this will compel them to stay in good physical shape. That's right. This law is also correct for another reason. If a spirited person vents his anger in this way, it will be less likely to lead him into more serious disputes. Certainly. But an older person will be authorized to rule and punish all the younger ones. Clearly. And surely it's also obvious that a younger person won't strike or do any sort of violence to an older one, or fail to show him respect in other ways, unless the rulers command it. For there are two guardians sufficient to prevent him from doing such things: shame and fear. Shame will prevent him from laying a hand on his parents, and so will the fear that others would come to the aid of the victim, some as his sons, some as his brothers, and some as his fathers. That's the effects they'll have. Then, in all cases, won't the laws induce men to live at peace with one another? Very much so. And if there's no discord among the guardians, there's no danger that the rest of the city will break into civil war, either with them or among themselves. Certainly not. I hesitate to mention, since they're so unseemly, the prettiest of evils the guardians would therefore escape: the poor man's flattery of the rich, the perplexities and sufferings involved in bringing up children, and in making their money necessary to feed the household, getting into debt, paying it off, and in some way or other providing enough money to hand over to the wives and household slaves to manage. All of the various troubles men endure in these matters are obvious, ignoble, and not worth discussing. They're obvious even to the blind. They will be free of all of these, and they will live a life more blessedly happy than those of the victors in the Olympian Games. How so? The Olympian victors are considered happy on account of only a small part of what is available to our guardians, for the guardians' victory is even greater, and their upkeep from public funds more complete. The victory they gain is the preservation of the whole city, and the crown of the victory that they and their children receive is their upkeep in all the necessities of life. They receive rewards from their own city while they live, and at their death, they're given a worthy burial. Those are very good things. Do you remember that earlier in our discussion, someone, I forget who, shocked us by saying that we hadn't made our guardians happy? It was possible for them to have everything that belonged to the citizens, and yet they had nothing. We said, I think, that if this happened to come up at some point, we'd look into it then, but that our concern at the time was to make our guardians true guardians, and the city the happiest we could, rather than looking to any one group within it, and moulding it for happiness. I remember. Well then, if the life of our auxiliaries is apparently much finer and better than that of Olympian victors, is there any need to compare it to the lives of cobblers, farmers, or other craftsmen? Not in my opinion. Then it's surely right to repeat here what I said then. If a guardian seeks happiness in such a way that he's no longer a guardian, and isn't satisfied with a life that's moderate, stable, and, as we say, best, but a silly adolescent's idea of happiness seizes him and incites him to use his power to take everything in the city for himself, he'll come to know true wisdom of Hesiod's saying that somehow the half is worth more than the whole. If he takes my advice, he'll keep to his own lifestyle. You agree, then, that the women and the men should associate with one another in education, and things having to do with children and in guarding the other citizens in the way we've described, that both when they remain in the city and when they go to war, they must guard it together, and hunt together, like dogs, and share in everything as far as possible, and that by doing so, they'll be doing what's best, and not for something contrary, either to woman's nature, as compared with men's, or to natural association of men and women with one another. I agree. Then doesn't it remain for us to determine whether it's possible to bring about this association among human beings, as it is among animals, and to say just how it might be done? You took the words right out of my mouth. As far as war is concerned, I think it's clear how they'll wage it. How so? Men and women will campaign together. They'll take the sturdy children with them, so that, like the children of other craftsmen, they can see what they'll have to do when they grow up. But in addition to observing, They can serve and assist in everything to do with the war, and help their mothers and fathers. Haven't you noticed in the other crafts how the children of potters, for example, assist and observe for a long time before actually making any pots? I have indeed. And should these craftsmen take more care in training their children by appropriate experience and observation than the guardians? Of course not, that would be completely ridiculous. Besides, every animal fights better in the presence of its young. That's so. But Socrates, there's a considerable danger that in a defeat, and such things are likely to happen in a war, they'll lose their children's lives as well as their own, making it impossible for the rest of the city to recover. What you say is true, but do you think that the first thing we should provide for is the avoidance of real danger? Not at all. Well then, if people will probably have to face some danger, shouldn't it be the sort that will make them better if they come through it successfully? Obviously. And what do you think that whether or not men who are going to be warriors observe warfare when they're still boys makes such a small difference that it isn't worth the danger of having them do it? No, it does make a difference to what you're talking about. On the assumption, then, that the children are to be observers of war, if we can contrive some way to keep them secure, everything will be fine, won't it? I suppose so. Well then, in the first place, their fathers won't be ignorant, will they, about which campaigns are dangerous and which are not, but rather as knowledgeable about this as any human can be. Probably so. Then they'll take the children to some campaigns, and not to others. Correct. And they'll put officers in charge of them whose age and experience qualifies them to be leaders and tutors. Appropriately so. But as we say, the unexpected often occurs. Indeed. With this in mind, we must provide the children with wings when they're small, so that they can fly away and escape. Socrates, what are you talking about? We must mount them on horses as early as possible. Not on spirited or aggressive horses, but on very fast and manageable ones. And when they've learned to ride, they must be taken to observe a war. In this way, they'll get the best look at their own work, and if the need arises, make the securest possible escape to safety, following their older guides. I think you're right. What about warfare itself? What attitude should your soldiers have to each other and to the enemy? Are my views right about this or not? Well, tell me what your views are. If one of them leaves his post, or throws away his shield, or does anything else of that sort, through cowardice, shouldn't he be reduced to being a craftsman or farmer? Certainly. And shouldn't anyone who is captured alive be left to his captors as a gift to do with as they wish? Absolutely. But don't you think that anyone who distinguishes himself and earns high esteem should, while still in the campaign, first be crowned with wreaths by each of his adolescents and children who accompany the expedition? I do. And what about shaken by the right hand? That too. And I suppose that you wouldn't go this far? Namely, that he should kiss and be kissed by each of them. That most of all. And I'll add this to the law. As long as the campaign lasts, no one he wants to kiss shall be allowed to refuse, for then, if one of them happens to be in love with one another, whether male or female, he'll be all the more eager to win the rewards of valour. Excellent. And we've already stated that since he's a good person, more marriages will be available to him, and he'll be selected for such things more frequently than the others. One moment. Getting a DM. There we go. Alright. He'll be selected more frequently than the others, so that he'll beget as many children as possible. Yes, we did say that. Indeed. According to Homer, too, it is just to honour in such ways those young people who are good, for he says that Ajax, when he distinguished himself in battle, was a reward with the long cut off the backbone. And that's an appropriate honour for a courageous young man, since it will both honour him and increase his strength. That's absolutely right. Then we'll follow Homer in these matters at least, and insofar as good people have shown themselves to be good, we'll honour them at sacrifices, and all such occasions with hymns, seats of honours, meats, and well-filled cups of wine. And in all the other ways we mentioned, so that, in addition to honouring good men and women, we'll continue to train them. Excellent. Alright. As far as those who died on the campaign, won't we say first of all that if their deaths were distinguished, they belong to the golden race? That above all. And won't we believe, with Hesiod, that whenever any of that race die, they become sacred demons living upon the earth, noble spirits, protectors against evil, and guardians of articulate mortals? We'll certainly believe that. Then we'll inquire from the god, speaking of Apollo, what kind of distinguished funeral we should give to demonic and godlike people, and we'll follow in his instructions. Of course. And for the remainder of time, we'll care for their graves and worship at them as we would of those daemons. And we'll follow the same rites for anyone whom we judge to have lived an outstandingly good life, whether he died of old age or in some other way. That is only just. Now, what about enemies? How will our soldiers deal with them? In what respects? First, enslavement. Do you think that it is just for Greeks to enslave Greek cities? Or, as far as they can, should they not even allow other cities to do so, and make a habit of sparing the Greek race, as a precaution against being enslaved by the barbarians? It's altogether in any way best to spare the Greek race. Then isn't it also best for the guardians not to acquire a Greek slave, and to advise the other Greeks not to do so either? Absolutely. In that way they're more likely to turn against the barbarians and keep their hands off one another. What about despoiling the dead? Is it a good idea to strip the dead of anything besides their armour after a victory? Or don't cowards make this an excuse for not facing the enemy, as if they were doing something of vital importance in bending over a corpse? And haven't many armies been lost because of such plundering? Indeed they have. Don't you think it's slavish and money-loving to strip a corpse? Isn't it the small-minded and womanish to regard the body as your enemy, when the enemy himself has flitted away, leaving behind only the instruments with which he fought? Or do you think that such behaviour any difference from that of dogs who get angry with the stone that hits them and leave the thrower alone? It's no difference at all. Then may our soldiers strip corpses or refuse the enemy permission to pick up their dead? No, by God, they most certainly not. Moreover, we won't take enemy arms to the temples as offerings, and if we care about the goodwill of other Greeks, we especially won't do this with their arms. Rather, we'd be afraid of polluting the temples if we brought them such good things from our own people, unless, of course, the god tells us otherwise. That's absolutely right. What about ravaging the land of the Greeks and burning their houses? Will your soldiers do such things of this sort to their enemies? I'd like to hear your opinion of that. Well, I think they should do neither of these things, but destroy the year's harvest only. Do you want to tell me why? Do you want me to tell you why? Of course. It seems to me that we have two names, war and civil war. So there are two things, and the names apply to two different kinds of disagreements arising in them. The two things I'm referring to are what is one's own and kin on the one hand, and what's foreign and strange on the other. The name civil war applies to hostilities with one's own, while simply war applies to hostilities with strangers. That's certainly the point. Then see whether this is also to the point. I say that the Greek race is its own and akin, but is strange and foreign to barbarians. That's right. Then, when the Greeks do battle with barbarians, or barbarians with Greeks, we'll say that they're natural enemies, and such hostilities are to be called war, But when Greeks fight with Greeks, we'll say that they are natural friends, and that in such circumstances, Greece is sick and divided into factions, and that such hostilities are to be called civil war. I, at any rate, agree to think of it that way. Now, notice that whenever something of the sort that's currently called civil war occurs and a city is divided, if either party ravages the land of the others and burns their houses, it's thought that this is abominable, that neither party loves their city, since otherwise they'd never have ravaged their very nurse and mother. However, it is thought appropriate for the victors to carry off the harvest of the vanquished. Nevertheless, their attitude of mind should be that of the people, who one day be reconciled, and who won't always be at war. This way of thinking is far more civilized than the other. What about the city you're founding? It is Greek, isn't it? It has to be. Then won't your citizens be good and civilized? Indeed they will. Then won't they love Greece? Won't they consider Greece as their own, and share the religion of other Greeks? Yes, indeed. Then won't they consider their differences with Greeks, people who are their own, not as war, but as civil war? Of course. And won't they quarrel like people who know that one day they'll be reconciled? Certainly. Then they'll moderate their foes in a friendly spirit, not punish them with enslavement and destruction, for they're moderators, not enemies. That's right. And being Greeks, they won't ravage Greece or burn her houses, nor will they agree that in any of her cities all the inhabitants, men, women, and children, are their enemies, but that whatever differences arise are caused by the few enemies that any city inevitably contains. Because of this, because the majority are friendly, they won't ravage the country or destroy the houses, and they'll continue their quarrel only to the point at which those who caused it are forced to pay the penalty by those who were its innocent victims. I agree that this is the way our citizens must treat their enemies, and they must treat barbarians the way Greeks currently treat each other. Then, shall we impose this law on the guardians? Neither ravage the country nor burn the houses? Well, consider it imposed. And let's also assume that this law and its predecessors are all fine. But I think, Socrates, that if we let you go on speaking about the subject, you'll never remember the one you set aside in order to say all of this, namely whether it's possible for the Constitution to come into being and in what way it could be brought about. I agree that if it existed, all the things we've mentioned would be good for the city in which they occurred. And I'll add some that you left out. The Guardians would be excellent fighters against an enemy, because they'd be least likely to desert each other, since they know each other as brothers, fathers, and sons, and call each other by those names. Moreover, if their women joined their campaign, either in the same ranks, or positioned in the rear to frighten the enemy, and in case their help should ever be needed, I know that this would make them quite unbeatable. And I also see all the good things that they'd have at home that you've admitted. Take it that I agree that all these things would happen, as well as innumerable ones, if this kind of constitution came into being, and say no more on that subject. But rather now, let's try to convince ourselves that it is possible, and how it is possible, and let the rest go. Oh, this is a sudden attack you've made on my arguments, and you show no sympathy for my delay. Perhaps you don't realize that, just as I've barely escaped from the first two waves of objections, you're bringing the third, the biggest and most difficult one, down upon me. When you see and hear it, you'll surely be completely sympathetic and recognize that it was, after all, appropriate for me to hesitate and be afraid to state and look into this so paradoxical a view. The more you speak like that, the less we'll let you off from telling us how it's possible for this constitution to come into being. So speak, instead of wasting time. Well then, we must first remember that we got to this point while trying to discover what justice and injustice are like. We must, but what of it? Nothing. But if we discover what justice is like, we will also maintain that the just man is in no way different from the just itself, so that he is like justice in every respect. Or will we be satisfied if he comes as close to it as possible and participates in it far more than anyone else? We'll certainly be satisfied with that. Then it was, in order to have a model, that we were trying to discover what justice itself is like, and what the completely just man would be like if he came into being, and what kind of man he'd be if he did, and likewise with regard to injustice and the most unjust man. We thought that, by looking at how their relationship to happiness and its opposite seemed to us, we'd also be compelled to agree about ourselves as well, that the one who was most like them would have a portion of happiness most like theirs. But we weren't trying to discover these things in order to prove that it's possible for them to come into being. That's true. Do you think that someone is a worse painter if, having painted a model of what the finest and most beautiful human being would be like, and having rendered every detail of his picture adequately, he could not prove that such a man could come into being? No, by God, I don't. Then what about our own case? Didn't we say that we were making a theoretical model of a good city? Certainly. So, do you think that our discussion will be any less reasonable if we can't prove that it's possible to found a city that's the same as the one in our theory? Not at all. Then that's the truth of the matter. But if, in order to please you, I must also be willing to show how and under what conditions it would be possible to found such a city, that you should agree to make the same concessions to me, in turn for the purposes of this demonstration. Which ones? Is it possible to do anything in practice the same as in theory? Or is it in the nature of practice to grasp truth less well than theory does, even if some people don't think so? Will you agree to this? I agree. Then don't compel me to show that what we've described in theory can come into being exactly as we've described it. Rather, if we're able to discover how a city could come to be governed in a way that most closely approximates our description, let's say that we've shown what you ordered us to show, namely that it's possible for our city to come to be. Or wouldn't you be satisfied with that? I would be satisfied with that. So would I. Then next, it seems, we should try to discover and point out what's now badly done in cities that keeps them from being governed in that way, and what the smallest change that would enable our city to reach our sort of constitution. One change, if possible, or if not one, two, and if not two, then the fewest in number and the least extensive. That's absolutely right. Let's drink some water. And don't compel me to show you what we've described in theory can come into being exactly as we've described. Rather, it would to discover how a city could come to be governed in the way that most closely. Sorry, I've gone back, haven't I? So would I. Then next, it seems, we should try to discover and point out what's now badly done in cities that keeps them from being governed in that way, and what the smallest change that would enable our city to reach our sort of constitution. One change, if possible, or if not two, and if not two, then the fewest number and the least extensive. That's absolutely right. There is one change we could point to that, in my opinion, would accomplish this. It's certainly neither small nor easy, but it is possible. What is it? Well, I've now come to what we liken to the greatest wave, but I shall say what I have to say, even if the wave is a wave of laughter that will simply drown me in ridicule and contempt. So listen to what I'm going to say. Say on. Until philosophers rule as kings, or those who are now called kings and leading men genuinely and adequately philosophize, that is, until political power and philosophy entirely coincide, while the many natures who at present pursue either one exclusively or are forcibly prevented from doing so, cities will have no rest from evil. Glaucon. Nor, I think, will the human race. Until this happens, the constitution we've been describing in theory will never be born to the fullest extent possible, or see the light of the sun. It's because I saw how very paradoxical this statement would be that I hesitated to make it for so long, for it's hard to face up to the fact that there can be no happiness, either public or private, in any other city. Socrates, after hurling a speech and statement like that at us, you must expect a great many people, and not undistinguished ones either, will cast off their cloaks and, stripped for action, snatch any available weapon and make a determined rush at you, ready to do terrible things. So unless you can hold them off by argument and escape, you really will pay the penalty of general derision. Well, you are the one that brought this on me, and I was right to do it. However, I won't betray you, but rather defend you in any way I can, by goodwill, by urging you on, and perhaps by being able to give you more appropriate answers than someone else. So with the promise of this assistance, try to show the unbelievers that things are as you say they are. I must try then, especially since you agree to be an ally. If we're to escape from the people you mention, I think we need to define for them who the philosophers are that we dare say must rule. And once that's clear, we should be able to defend ourselves by showing that the people we mean are fitted by nature to both engage in philosophy and to rule in a city, while the rest are naturally fitted to leave philosophy alone and follow their leader. This would be a good time to give that definition. Oh, come then, follow me, and we'll see whether or not there's some way to set it out adequately. Lead on. Do you need to be reminded, or do you remember, that if it's rightly said that someone loves something, then he mustn't love one part of it and not another, but he must love the whole part of it. The whole of it, excuse me. I think you have to remind me, for I don't understand it at all. That would be an appropriate response, Glaucon, for somebody else to make, but it isn't appropriate for an erotically inclined man to forget all the boys in the bloom of youth, pique the interest of a lover of boys, and arouse him, and that all seem worthy of his care and pleasure. Or isn't that the way you people behave to fine and beautiful boys? You praise a snub-nosed one as cute, a hook-nosed one you say is regal, one in between is well-proportioned. Dark ones look manly, and pale ones are the children of the gods. And as for a honey-coloured boy, do you think that this very term is anything but the euphemistic coinage of a lover who has found it easy to tolerate sallowness, provided it was accompanied by the bloom of youth? In a word, you find all kinds of terms and excuses so as to not reject anyone whose flower is in bloom. If you insist on taking me as your example of what erotically inclined men do, then, for the sake of argument, I agree. Further, don't you see wine lovers behave in the same way? Don't they love every kind of wine, and find any excuse to enjoy it? Certainly. And I think you see honour lovers. If they can't be generals, be captains, and if they can't be honoured by people of importance and dignity, they put up with being honoured by insignificant and inferior ones, for they desire the whole of honour. Exactly. Then, do you agree to this or not? When we say that someone desires something, do we mean that he desires everything of that kind, or that he desires one part of it, but not another? We mean he desires everything. Then won't we say, also, that the philosopher doesn't desire one part of wisdom, rather than another, but he desires the whole of it? Yes, certainly. And as for one who's choosy about what he learns, especially if he's young and can't yet give an account of what is useful and what isn't, we won't say that he is a lover of learning or a philosopher, for we wouldn't say that someone who is choosy about his food is hungry, or has an appetite for food, or is a lover of food. Instead, we'd say that he is a bad eater. And we'd be right to say it. But the one who readily and willingly tries all kinds of learning, who turns gladly to learning and is insatiable for it, is rightly called a philosopher, isn't he? Then many strange people will be philosophers, for the lovers of sights seem to be included, since they take pleasure in learning things. And the lovers of sounds are very strange people to include as philosophers, for they would never willingly attend a serious discussion or spend their time that way, yet they run around to all the Dionysic festivals, omitting none, whether in cities or villages, as if their ears were under contract to listen to every chorus. Are we to say that these people and those who learn similar things or petty crafts are philosophers? Oh, no, but they are like philosophers. And so who are the true philosophers? Those who love the sight of truth. That's right. But what exactly do you mean by that? It would not be easy to explain to someone else, but I think that you will agree to this. To what? Since the beautiful is the opposite of the ugly, they are two, of course. And since they are two, each is one. I grant that also. And the same account is true of the just and the unjust, the good and the bad, and all the forms. Each of them is itself one, but because they are manifest, themselves everywhere in association with actions, bodies, and another, each of them appears to be many. That's right. So I draw this distinction. On one side are those you just now called lovers of sights, lovers of crafts, and practical people. On the other side are those we are arguing about, and whom one alone could call philosophers. How do you mean? The lovers of sights and sounds, like beautiful sounds, colours and shapes and everything fashioned out of them, but their thought is unable to see and embrace the nature of the beautiful itself. That's for sure. In fact, there are very few people who would be able to reach the beautiful itself and see it by itself. Isn't that so? Certainly. What about someone who believes in beautiful things, but doesn't believe in the beautiful itself, and isn't able to follow anyone who could lead him to the knowledge of it? Don't you think he is living in a dream rather than in a awakened state? Isn't this dreaming, whether asleep or awake, to think that a likeness is not a likeness, but rather the thing itself that it is like? I certainly think that someone who does this is dreaming. But someone who, to take the opposite case, believes in the beautiful itself, we can see both it and the things that participate in it, don't believe that the participants are it, or that it itself is the participants. Is he living in a dream, or is he awake? He is very much awake. So we'd be right to call his thought knowledge, since he knows, but we should call the other person's thought opinion, since he opines. Right. What if the person who has opinion, but not knowledge, is angry with us and disputes the truth of what we are saying? Is there some way to console him and persuade him gently, or hiding from him that he isn't in his right mind? Oh, there hopefully must be. Consider then what we'll say to him. Why do we question him like this? First, we'll tell him that no one begrudges him any knowledge that he may have, and that we'll be delighted to discover that he knows something. Then we'll say, tell us, does the person who knows something or nothing? Answer for him. He knows something. Something that is, or something that is not? Something that is, for how could something that is not be known? Then we have an adequate grasp of this. No matter how many ways we examine it, what is completely knowable, and what is in no way is in every way inconceivable. A most adequate one. Good. Now, if anything is such as to be, and also not to be, won't it be intermediate between what it purely is and what it in no way is? Yes, an intermediate. Then, as knowledge is set over what it is, while ignorance is of necessity set over what is not, mustn't we find an intermediate between knowledge and ignorance, to be set over what is intermediate between what is and what is not, if there is such a thing at all? Certainly. Do we say that opinion is something? Of course. A different power from knowledge, or the same? A different one. Opinion, then, is set over one thing and knowledge over another, according to the power of each. Right. Now, isn't knowledge by its nature set over what is? To know to know it as it is. Let me read that one again. Now, isn't knowledge by its nature set over what is, to know it as it is? But first, maybe we be a bit more explicit. Powers are a class of things that are to enable us. Powers are a class of things that enable us, or anything else for that matter, to do whatever we are capable of doing. Sight, for example, and hearing are among the powers, if you understand the kind of thing I'm referring to. I do. Here's what I think about them. A power has neither colour nor shape, nor any feature of the sort that many other things have, and that are used to distinguish those things from one another. In the case of a power, I use only what it is set over and what it does, and by reference to those, I call each the power that it is. What is set over the same things and does the same things, I call the same power. What is set over something different and does something different, I call a different one. Do you agree? I do. Then let's back up. Is knowledge a power, or what class would you put it in? Well, it's a power, the strongest of them all. And what about opinion? Is it a power? Or some kind of thing? It's a power as well, for it enables us to opine. A moment ago, you agreed that knowledge and opinion aren't the same. How could a person with any understanding think that a fallible power is the same as an infallible one? Right. Then we agreed that opinion is clearly different from knowledge. It is different. Hence, each of them is by nature set over something different and does something different. Necessarily. Knowledge is set over what is to know what it as it is. Yes. And opinion opines. Yes. Does it opine the very thing that knowledge knows, so that the knowable and the opinable are the same thing, or is this impossible? It is impossible, given what we've agreed, for if a different power is set over something different, and opinion and knowledge are different powers, then the knowable and the opinable cannot be the same. Then if what is knowable, the opinable must be something other than what is. It must. Then, do we opine what is not? Or is it impossible to opine what is not? Think about this. Doesn't someone who opines set his opinion over something? Or is it possible to opine and yet not to opine? Impossible. For someone who opines some one thing. Yes. Surely the most accurate word for that isn't one thing, but no thing. Hang on, he had a double negative here. Let me read that one again. Surely the most accurate word for that, which is not, isn't one thing, but nothing. Certainly. But we had set ignorance over what is not, and knowledge over what is. That's right. So someone opines neither what is, nor what is not. How could it be otherwise? Then opinion is neither ignorance nor knowledge. So it seems. Then does it go beyond either of these? Is it clearer than knowledge, or darker than ignorance? I think it's neither. Is opinion, then, darker than knowledge, but clearer than ignorance? I suppose it goes in there. Then it lies between them. Yes. So, opinion is intermediate between the two. Absolutely. Now, we've said that, if something could be shown, as it were, to be and not be at the same time, it would be intermediate between what purely is and what in every way is not, that neither knowledge nor ignorance would be set over it, but something intermediate between ignorance and knowledge. Correct. And now the thing we call opinion has emerged as being intermediate between the two. It has. Apparently, then, it only remains for us to find participants in both being and not being, and cannot correctly be called purely one or the other. In order that, if there is such a thing, we can rightly call it the opinable, therefore setting the extremes over the extremes and the intermediate over the intermediate. Isn't that so? It is. Now that these points have been established, I want to address a question to our friend who doesn't believe in the beautiful itself, or any form of the beautiful itself that remains always the same in all respects, but who does believe in the many beautiful things. The lover of sights, who wouldn't allow anyone else to say that the beautiful itself is one, or that the just is one, or any of the rest. My dear fellow, we'll say, of all the many beautiful things, is there one that will not also appear ugly? Or is there one of those just things that will not also appear to be unjust? Or any of those pious things that will not also appear impious? There isn't one, for it is necessary that they appear to be beautiful in a way and also to be ugly in a way. And the same with the other things you'd asked about. What about the many doubles? Do they appear any less halves than doubles? Not one. So with the many bigs and smalls, lights and heavies, is any one of them any more what we say it is than its opposite? No, each of them always participates in both opposites. In any of the manys, what we say it is, then any more than it is not what he says it is. No, like they're like ambiguities one is entertained with at dinner parties, or like children's riddles about the eunuch who threw something at the bat, the one about which he threw it and what it was in. For they are ambiguous, and one cannot understand them as fixedly being or fixedly not being, or as both or as neither. Then how do you know how to deal with them? Or can you find a more appropriate place to put them than the intermediate between being and not being? Surely they can't be more than, or more than what is, or not be more than what is, for apparently nothing is darker than what is not, or clearer than what is. Very true. We've now discovered, it seems, that many conventions of the majority of people about beauty and the others are rolling around as intermediates between what is and what is not. We have. And we agreed earlier that anything of that kind would have to be called the opinable, not the knowable, the wandering intermediate grasped by the intermediate power. We did. And as for those who study the many beautiful things but do not see the beautiful itself, and are incapable of following another who leads them to it, who see many just things but not the just itself, and so with everything, these people we shall say opine about everything but have no knowledge of anything they opine, necessarily. What about the ones who, in each case, study the things themselves, that are always the same in every respect? Won't we say that they know and don't opine? That's necessarily true. Shall we then say that these people love and embrace the things that knowledge is set over, as others do the things that opinion is set over? Remember we said that the latter saw and loved beautiful sounds, and colours and the like, but won't allow the beautiful itself to be anything. We remember, all right? We won't be in error, then, if we call such people lovers of opinions rather than philosophers, or lovers of wisdom and knowledge. Will they be angry with us if we call them that? Not if they take my advice, for it isn't right to be angry with those who speak the truth. As for those who, in each case, embrace the thing itself, we must call them philosophers, not lovers of opinion. Most definitely. That's the end of the book 5. That got really heavy at the end there. I'll have to read that a second time when I take my notes to figure out what the hell that was all about. I think I also got distracted today, which is unfortunate, and that broke my train of thought. But I'm going to leave you here, and thank you for watching.